Okay, hi class. I realize it's a little bit weird to not be in class, but for online people, you're used to it. Yeah, I might have been exposed to the coronavirus, which is fine. We're gonna check and see it, but I'm fine, I think. I just don't want to, give the plague to everybody. So yeah, I'll send out an email about what's going on, and we're gonna go through today's lecture. Honestly, if any lecture to do not in person, this is probably the easiest one, because a lot of it is going to just be you getting familiar with where the muscles are. So we're going to go through things pretty quickly. I have a couple of videos for you to watch, and here we go. So, a flashlight, if you have a flashlight, you can turn it on or off. I mean, if you have fancy flashlights, you can do other things, but typically a flashlight is either on or off, right? If you want to make things brighter with a flashlight, the typical option isn't to turn it on brighter because it only goes on and off. It's to use more flashlights or to keep it on for a longer amount of time. And that's kind of how muscles are going to work. So for one single muscle fiber, the contraction either happens or it doesn't. So in order to have graded responses or different strengths of muscle contractions, you need to do something else. So the deal is, in a skeletal muscle, not all the fibers get stimulated to turn on at the same time. So different combinations of how many of these fibers are being signaled are going to give rise to different responses. So you can have these graded responses with different degrees of how much shortening the muscle has, and also the strength of that contraction. That contraction of the whole muscle as a group rather than just a fiber. So you produce these graded responses by either changing the frequency of stimulation, right? So as your motor neurons send signals one after the other, after the other, after the other, it increases the stimulation, or you increase the number of muscle cells being stimulated. So you send signals to a whole bunch of muscle fibers as opposed to just one or two or three or a few. So the twitch was what we saw last Thursday. This is a single brief contraction. You're not expecting that to happen normally. You'll see it in lab. You'll see it like when you look under the microscope, you could see just like a muscle fiber contract. That's not what you normally expect to see, but it's theoretically the smallest amount you can get done. What's much more normal, what happens physiologically, is these contractions get summed together. So the muscle back here in the twitch, it got stimulated and it returned back to normal. Typically, you're expecting that not to happen. You're expecting the stimulation to be fast enough that the muscle contracts, it starts to relax, and there comes another stimulation and it's back. It has additional tension. Alright, we're looking at tension here along the y-axis. Right? So, excuse me. You could have something called tetanus, which is this, where even though a little bit of relaxation happens, the nerve stimuli happens fast enough that those contractions sum. They start to be greater than you'd expect otherwise, right? So here we've had a series of stimulating events, right? The motor neuron's been talking to the muscle, and the muscle now has this unfused tetanus, meaning it tries to relax between stimulations, but it's not getting there. You could take this to the extreme, and this is looks like this, where relaxation doesn't happen between contractions, and this is because the stimulation's fast enough that it just keeps building tension. This is what you expect when you have some sort of smooth muscle contraction that's sustained. It looks like this. where it looks like just one smooth signal, one smooth response, right? There's no relaxation between here, it just builds. But the reason this happens is because there are rapid enough nervous impulses that makes that nice, beautiful curve. It's called tetanus. Yeah. I feel like I should pause, ask for questions, stare deeply into the camera. We're just gonna keep going though. So, the muscle force, how much you get out of this is going to depend on how many fibers got stimulated, right? So, the more muscle fibers that got stimulated, the more muscle tension you can get. Muscles can keep contracting up until they run out of energy, and we'll see how they get energy in a minute. Right now, there are 3 ways, and they each have pros and cons, and the human body uses all of them. It's not like there's one that's the best one. You need all of them, and they're used slightly differently. Regardless of the version you're using, you're going to use ATP. So ATP is it's the source of energy for muscle contractions. Some of it's stored in muscle fibers, but that's gone lightning fast. After that first burst is used up, you need other pathways to keep producing ATP. Now, when you were looking, excuse me. Pardon. It still feels weird to do this just on camera. It feels weird to do it on camera when there's a whole bunch of students in class, but it feels more weird to do it just talking to my wall. Anyways, you saw as you were looking at muscle fibers that there were a ton of mitochondria in the fibers, and the ATP consumption requirements for muscles is huge. So the 3 ways you're going to generate ATP is by directly phosphorylating ADP, or by aerobic respiration. This is probably the one you're most familiar with. Or by anaerobic glycolysis. So aerobic respiration happens in the presence of oxygen. Anaerobic glycolysis, along with the lactic acid formation that happens, doesn't require oxygen. So we're going to see all of these briefly. So you've got a little bit of ATP stored that's gone lightning fast. You want some more ATP for muscle contraction. What you do is you directly phosphorylate ADP. So ADP is diphosphate here. TP is triphosphate. So if you add the other phosphate group back on, you're back to ADP, right? So creatine phosphate, CP, it's really fast. Muscles are going to store creatine phosphate. It's this really, really high energy molecule. So ATP is going to get used. ADP remains, right? So this phosphate comes off. You're left with ADP. Creatine phosphate is going to transfer that phosphate group back onto ADP, and it regenerates ATP. So you're going to make about 1 ATP molecule for every creatine phosphate molecule you get. You got about 15 seconds worth of this stuff stored of creatine phosphate, which isn't that long, but it's long enough to buy you some time. So it's a very straightforward reaction, right? Your muscle cells need ATP, got creatine phosphate, ADP. You pull the phosphate off here, add it here. You end up from creatine phosphate. You go just to creatine by itself. ADP is now ATP. You don't need oxygen. Really fast. The problem is you only have a few seconds worth of creatine phosphate that you can use. The most efficient way to get this done is to not use creatine phosphate, but to use aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration, as you, I hope, recall from, say, Gen Bio or some other class, is going to be the breakdown of organic fuel in the presence of oxygen, you're going to do the whole classic electron transport chain, the whole bit. So the short version of this, and I realize you've learned longer versions of this, is glucose, or some fuel, but for us we're going to go for glucose as the classic example. Glucose, it's a sugar. It's got 6 carbons in it. You break down that molecule of glucose. You capture the high energy electrons, use them to power the phosphorylation of ADP into ATP. So glucose gets broken down to carbon dioxide and water. As this happens, you release energy. One glucose molecule is enough for about 32 ATPs, whereas back up here with creatine phosphate, you only get 1 ATP per creatine. Per creatine phosphate. So this whole aerobic respiration thing is much more efficient. The problems with it is it takes oxygen, which is fine. Usually you have plenty of oxygen, but sometimes you don't. And it's a multi-step process. It's slower. So here's the picture here. You can use glucose to power this. If you do that, you end up with pyruvic acid. Whether it's pyruvic acid or fatty acids or amino acids, you can use a bunch of these different organic fuels to power the electron transport chain, which is going to power the production of ATP. But you absolutely have to have oxygen for this second part, for this part that occurs in the mitochondria. So long as you've got oxygen for this, you can run it for hours and hours. It's very efficient and it doesn't build up weird side products. So you do produce carbon dioxide. You should be blowing that off as you breathe. You produce a little bit of water doing this. So yeah, so far so good. But you're consuming oxygen. Great. Now, you might have noticed we've got basically 2 options so far. We have this first one, this creatine phosphate, lightning fast, but you only have a few seconds stored, or a few seconds ability to get this done. Aerobic respiration you could do for hours and hours and hours, but it's slow. And you could imagine perhaps that it's slow and it needs oxygen. You could imagine some scenario where you don't have the oxygen, or you need ATP really quickly, but you've already burned through your creatine phosphate, and now you're kind of in this weird middle zone. And that is where, fortunately, anaerobic glycolysis comes in. So this reaction's not very efficient. The aerobic pathway is really, really efficient, the pathway that uses oxygen. Anaerobic glycolysis with lactic acid formation doesn't take oxygen. It doesn't take oxygen, and it's really fast. So it can bridge that gap between when you're out of creatine phosphate, but you haven't made enough via aerobic respiration. So again, you're going to break down glucose. This you don't need the oxygen for, though. Glucose gets broken down to pyruvic acid and produces about 2 ATP. It's actually the first step in the aerobic pathway as well, but you don't keep going. Pyruvic acid then, instead of getting broken down via the citric acid cycle, gets converted into lactic acid. Not very efficient, very fast. The problem is you burn through massive amounts of glucose doing this, right? So back here you get about 32 ATPs per glucose, right? Here you get 2 per glucose, so it's much less efficient. And you also build up a bunch of lactic acids doing this. It's not known for sure, but the thought is when you get like a stitch in your side, that's often, the thought is it's probably the lactic acid buildup that you're feeling. So lactic acid you can't just breathe off like you can breathe off carbon dioxide. And you might have noticed that you're typically going to get a stitch in your side when the muscle demands you have are exceeding basically the oxygen you're pulling in, right? So if you get a stitch in your side and you start going, you'll feel better, right? Because you'll be able to get more oxygen into your system. So here's that picture of the anaerobic pathway. It's the pathway that doesn't need oxygen. You're using glucose for this, getting a little bit of ATP, getting some lactic acid. You don't have a ton of time for this, but it's enough to get you going. Now, your muscles can hurt because of lots of reasons. And you probably have noticed this before. If the muscle activity is really, really strenuous, right? So sitting up shouldn't cause this, but like if you're exceeding the normal demands of them, sometimes you can mess around with the ionic balances. You can also, you'll accumulate lactic acid. You can deplete the energy sources, but you can return this to normal. The oxygen deficit gets repaid. That's done by, breathing, so keep doing that. That's great. And that's where we are. Okay, moving on. So that's how these muscles get the energy. Muscle contractions come in a couple different types. So, like, yes, they came in, graded responses or twitches back up here. But muscle contractions can do a couple different things. So, sorry, my mouse is really glitchy. So, the classic picture that you're looking at is when you see sarcomere shortening, right, and tension being built, and the whole muscle length gets shorter, right, it contracts, and tension is supplied, and there we go. That situation, that's like the classic one to see when you're first thinking about it. Those little myofilaments, right, those little filaments you have, are able to slide past each other, right? So actin and myosin form their little cross bridges, and the whole muscle shortens because they slide together, right? So this happens as like when you bend your knee, when you rotate your arm, muscles, you'll see that shorten. The tension should be the same from the beginning to the end. The tension should be about the same, right? The tension, how much is pulling, right? Because as it pulls, it shortens. It's called isotonic contractions, meaning the tension gets to stay the same throughout the whole process. You can also have contractions, though, where the muscle doesn't shorten, but you still have tension in the muscle. So, like, if you push hard against a wall, right, your elbows bent, you're pushing hard against the wall, nothing's actually changing length, right? You're not pushing against it and going back, you're not going forwards. The length of that muscle is the same. It's isometric, meaning the same length, but you increase the tension. So you can push really, really hard. Maybe a better way to think of it is if you're holding your hands out like this, right? If someone puts a feather on your hand, right, there's not that much tension. If somebody put, a big book, you'd have more tension, but either way, the muscle length stayed the same between the two of them. So yeah, both types of muscle contractions can happen. There's a nice Khan Academy video that goes through a bunch of this. If you're interested, I'd suggest watching it. It's beyond what we need to know for this class, but especially people who are going to be physical trainer type people, this might be interesting for you. Here's the picture for this. This is the isotonic contraction, right? So the tension's there, right? And the muscle contracts, lifts this weight up. Great. As we're looking at that, we can see the tension that's developed, right? So a little bit happens first, and then it holds, right? Holds some level of tension. The muscle relaxes. And here we're looking at the muscle length. So right here, it's 100% of its length, right? As the weight is applied and the, as the muscle tries to lift that weight back up here, as it contracts, the muscle shortens, and then when it relaxes, it goes back to its complete length, right? Isometric is going to be something different, right? So the muscle is holding this weight, the muscle contracts, but it's not actually shortening length, right? So same deal here, you get tension, muscle relaxes, but muscle length is always the same. The electrochemical and mechanical events that occur either way are the same. So in isotonic contractions, the actin filaments shorten and that causes movement. In isometric contractions, those cross bridges generate force, but the actin filaments don't shorten. So it's basically like if you've ever gotten a car stuck in sand and you can hit the gas and the wheels just spin, right? Something's happening, but you don't go forward. So myosin heads are basically grabbing at the same actin binding spot again and again. So again, you'll have force either way, but it's whether or not you're shortening that muscle. Great. So far so good? I hope. I mean, I guess not. If not, email me, I guess. So yeah, on the next topic. Today honestly is like the catch-all bag of other muscle topics, assuming that you now know about how actin and myosin work, this event of the neuromuscular junction, what happens to cause contraction, right? Today is kind of a catch-all of the rest of them. So one of those catch-all things is muscle tone. Muscle tone is going to keep muscles ready to go. And basically what it is nerve impulses are delivered to different cells within like a large muscle, right? Just different individual muscle fibers get signaled just to contract a little bit. It's not like the whole muscle's not contracting, but a whole bunch of little nerve impulses. It's kind of background noise almost, and it just keeps things toned. If the nerve supply is destroyed, muscle loses tone. It atrophies really, really quickly. But yeah, muscles typically are expecting to have at least some nervous input pretty much constantly. Just kind of to keep them listening a little bit, and the cell's response to it. If the cells aren't stimulated that way, they stop being able to respond so well, and the muscle atrophies dramatically. Okay, you know this. Exercise impacts muscles, right? So if you do endurance kind of exercise, right, whether that's biking or jogging, you're going to get muscles that fatigue less quickly. So you'll not run out of oomph quite so quickly. Right? Also, it's going to help make your body metabolism more efficient. So as you're breaking down, say, glucose into ATP, you're better at it to a certain point. There are some upper limits here. But if you don't exercise, muscles aren't very efficient at doing it. And you can improve your coordination, right? You can do all these sorts of things. if you do a resistance exercise, things like weightlifting, you'll increase the muscle size and strength, right? And anybody who's been an athlete or has been training probably knows you try to do both of these types of things, right? You want to increase the muscle's resistance to fatigue, and you also probably want to increase the muscle's strength. Great. That, up to here, goes so much faster. Anyways, up to here is kind of the physiological part. For the rest of today, we're looking at more anatomical considerations. So, I mean, it's still physiological, but it's kind of more of the naming stuff. Alright, muscles, typically with bones, are going to be what's going to bring about movement. So muscles are attached at two spots. That can be more, but we're expecting two spots. There's something called the origin, and that's where it attaches to a less movable or immovable bone. So that's like fixed, it's the anchor point. And the insertion is the attachment to a movable bone. It's the part that does the moving. So something like this. This is the origin up here, right? This is the insertion. This bone right here, you're not expecting to be doing movement with this muscle, right? It's going to act as the anchor point, and as this muscle contracts, you'll raise your forearm. Do we see that? Right? This is the insertion here. This is the more movable bone, right? As this contracts, you're not expecting your shoulders to get pulled down, you're expecting your forearms to get pulled up. Couple just notes. With a very few exceptions, all skeletal muscles are going to cross a joint. Generally, most of the muscle is going to be proximal to the joint crossed. So that's something like this, right? So most of the muscle is proximal to this joint here, right? It's on this side, right? Here's the tendon here. Skeletal muscles, you're expecting an origin and insertion. Skeletal muscles are going to pull, they're not going to push, right? So you're not going to have, this muscle here isn't going to push your forearm away. As it contracts, it's going to pull it forwards, or pull up. We'll see soon what the pulling up terms are called, right? And when that muscle contracts, you're moving the insertion towards the origin. So like right here, right, this is the insertion. You're pulling it towards the origin. Fair enough? I hope. This makes sense. There are lots of types of body movement. I'm going to go through them briefly. There's this YouTube sing-along video to the tune of London Bridge that you could watch that could go through all of the body movements for you. So flexion is going to decrease the angle of a joint, right? So it's going to be typically bending a hinge joint, right? It brings two bones closer together. Extension is the opposite. It's going to increase the angle between two bones, right? So flexion, extension. If you move beyond 180 degrees, it's hyperextension, right? Like if my forearm goes way back, that's kind of a problem. Typically it's a problem. So we could have flexion, extension, hyperextension here. If your head, right, you can hyperextend your head, you can flex. Yes. You can also rotate. Rotation's when you move a bone around its long axis, right? So if you shake your head, that's rotation. Abduction is moving a limb away from midline. You can think of alien abduction. This is an alien. It's abducting its arm, right? This limb is going away from midline. Midline here, lifting up and away. Adduction is the opposite. It's moving the limb back down towards the midline. Circumduction is this beautiful thing that's happening. It's when you keep the proximal end of the bone is stationary, but the distal end moves in a circle. Like here on her hand, right? There comes some special movements that get their own names. You can have dorsiflexion, which is where you pull your foot up like that. You can have plantar flexion, which is where you depress the foot, where you basically point the toes, right, down like this. They both get their own special names. You can also, you know how like, feet are funky. You know how like when you're walking, you normally walk just like normally with your feet flat on the ground. I mean with the arch, but your feet there. Your heel touches, the ball of your foot touches, right there. You can also, you'll see it more if you have like bad shoes. You'll either walk kind of on the outside of your foot, or you'll walk on the inside of your foot. That's not recommended, but you can do it. When you turn, so your sole of your foot turns medially, that's called inversion, and eversion is when you turn it laterally. So like, if you were to walk along this part of your foot, right, you've had inversion happen. If you're walking along this part of your foot, you've had eversion happen. I mean, even if you don't walk in it, you've had those two things happen. You can do it. This one, it's a good muscle movement to have. If you're not careful, this is how people can like roll their ankles, right? So be careful. A couple other special movements. Supination. This one is interesting because the way the muscle and bone situation is set up, you can, well, okay, supination and pronation. You can rotate. Yeah, let me see a picture here. Okay. When you rotate your forearms, you're moving lots of things relative to each other. You're moving your radius and your ulna, right? So when you have pronation, when you pronate, the radius crosses over the ulna. Do you see that cross there? Whereas if you go back to supination, the radius and ulna run parallel to each other, which is interesting. One of the most congratulations for being human kind of movement is called opposition, which is the ability to do this, right? Where you can move your thumb to touch the fingers on the other hand. That is huge. The ability to do that. You can't do that with your big toe, right? You can't. I mean, if you can, that's cool, but you can't. Where you can move your big toe to like touch your pinky toe. That's gonna happen. But opposition, you can do that with your thumb. And it's not just about touching your fingers, it's about being able to then grasp things a certain way. This is where the opposable thumbs that have opposition, that's where that comes from. Opposable thumbs. They're great. Whew, doing okay? I hope you're not like eating popcorn or lunch or something while you watch these. Okay, so typically groups of muscles are going to act in such a way that they produce an action on the opposite side of the joint. So you've got your pecs right here, right? As they contract, so if it crosses on the anterior, crosses on the front of the joint, you're expecting it to have flexion. There is the major caveat of the knee and the ankle are kind of funky, but in general, if it's crossing on the anterior side, you're expecting it to flex. If the muscle's crossing on the on the back of the joint, posterior side, when it contracts, you're expecting extension, right? And again, knee and ankle are kind of different because they're rotated oddly relative to everything else. If your muscle's crossing on the lateral side, you're producing abduction, right? So The deltoid muscle here, right? We're here at the shoulder. It's on the lateral side, right? So this is midline, this is lateral side. As it contracts, it pulls it away from midline, right? This bone here is being abducted. If it's crossing on the medial side, right? If it's crossing into, as it contracts, it's producing adduction. So it's pulling it towards midline. Fair enough? That's somewhat intuitive just as you look at it, you're like, okay, yeah, if it pulls there, it's going to pull up. If it pulls here, it's going to pull down. If it pulls here, it's going to pull forward. If it pulls back here, it's going to pull back. Types of muscles, just for some terms. The muscle that's doing the thing for a certain type of movement is called the prime mover, right? The muscle that's doing the opposite of that thing is called the antagonist, right? So depending on which muscle you're talking about, these terms can be different, right? So you've got a prime mover muscle, a muscle that's doing some movement. There's an antagonist which is going to either oppose or reverse that prime mover. The synergist is going to help the muscle that's mainly doing what it's supposed to be doing, the prime mover. It's going to help, and it's going to help prevent weird rotations or problems, right? So synergist, it's not the prime mover, but it's going to help the prime mover. And the fixator is going to stabilize the origin of the prime mover. It's going to keep things stable enough for this to occur. Yeah? Whew. I realize I take breaks, I guess, during lecture where I talk about things. Alright. So, that's one conceptual idea done. We're now going to look at 3 things briefly. How muscles are going to bring about movement. Actually, we just talked about that. I meant to put this earlier, sorry. How to name muscles, and some about leverage. Okay? So, depending on what you end up doing with your life, you either will memorize every single muscle in the body, or you won't. Okay? For us, for this class, I care deeply if you know how muscles work, right? Actin, myosin, calcium, ATP, right? That kind of thing. I don't care if you know all the muscle names in the human body. There are a lot. But you should know a couple things so that if you see a muscle name, you at least know what we're looking at. So muscles are typically named in 1 of 3 ways, and there's also often combinations here. They're named, they're named by the part of the body it's associated with, right? So the temporalis is over the temporal bone, right? And so seeing this muscle name, you've got an idea of where it's at, right? They're sometimes named by the shape. So the deltoid muscle looks triangular, right? And so like, delta this or delta that is a triangular shape. The deltoid muscle is triangular. They're often named by size. So if you see muscle name maximus, it means big. Minimus, small. And then longus is meaning long, right? You could also name things by how little muscle fibers are setting themselves up. So some muscle that's called this or that rectus, you're expecting the fibers to run straight. If it's transversus, you're expecting it to run transverse to each other, right angles. And oblique, so like, oblique muscles, you're going to have them, they're going to be at angles to some axis. You're also going to describe things by the number of origins. So bicep has 2 origins, tricep has 3. Just different ways to name muscles, and so when you're reading something, you know what's going on. Additional ways this is done is by describing the point of origin and insertion. And you name origin first. So sternocleidomastoid, right? You've got sternum and clavicle, and there's insertion on the mastoid process. Right? So looking here, you might not know exactly where the muscle is, but you've got some idea of, okay, it's somewhere up, gonna hang on to the sternum and clavicle, and the sternal part came first, so that's gonna be the origin, and clavicle is gonna be the insertion, right? Muscles can also be named for the action they produce, like flexor or extensor, and you can combine lots of these. So, something like an extensor carpi radialis longus. It extends the wrist, there's the radius here, and it's long. Yeah? So with this fascicle arrangement, though, if you're describing how muscle fibers are running, there are a couple patterns that are going to keep showing up in. They show up in lots of patterns, but the four most common are these ones. So there are going to be some fascicle arrangements that are circular. So that's, say, going to be around the eye. It's shown here around the mouth, right? Concentric rings is going to be circular. There's going to be convergence, where you've got a really broad origin, and then the fascicles converge towards an insertion, right? So the pecs are a good example of this, right? Where you've got a really, really broad origin, and all converges towards a tendon insertion, right? It converges down. You can have parallel. This is when you see really long, like strap-like muscles, right? Like here. Those fascicles are running parallel to each other, right? Fusiform are going to be, they're called spindle-shaped. It's this like lumpy out in the middle to two smaller ends. Those ones are called fusiform, and that's a fairly common muscle shape to be. There's also pinnate, which is going to be some short little muscle fascicles that are attached to some sort of central tendon, right? So lots of places this can occur, but yeah, you've got that picture. The fascicles are going to determine the range of motion, right? Because how much can this shorten? Long muscles that are basically parallel to the long axis can shorten a bunch. They're not usually that powerful. So if you've got some like long muscle here, it can shorten dramatically, right? It can go from being really long to being really short. It can shorten a long ways. You're expecting a fair bit of movement. Muscle fibers that are really short, and there's a bunch of them, you're expecting them to shorten not that much, but be really powerful when they do that. I hope this makes sense. This is something that I would draw on the board or speak to you guys about if we were in class. If there's questions about that, please ask me. Alright? So those are muscles. But muscles don't exist just in isolation. Muscles are going to, they're attached to bones, typically, these skeletal muscles we're talking about. And they're going to set themselves up as levers. So your book has a whole series of pictures about whether it's a primary lever or a secondary lever, which order of lever it is. It's interesting. For our intents and purposes, we're just going to see muscles as levers in general. So most skeletal muscles are going to be using leverage, and a lever has four main parts, depending on what we care about. You've got the lever, which is like a rigid bar, right? It's going to move on some point. That point, that fixation point, is called the fulcrum, okay? So you've got this bar, you've got a fulcrum, right? So pretend the top finger isn't there, but it's just here in the fulcrum. The effort is the force that the muscle is going to apply to this lever, right? So if I pull down this lever, the force that muscle applies to it, that's the effort. The load is whatever bone and tissue and any weight is added that needs to move by that effort, right? So lever, fulcrum that it's on, effort to move it, and load is this resistive mass. Now, this is another thing I was going to do in person, but levers are going to set up. They're set up in different ways. Lots of different ways to do that, but levers are going to make it so you can move a heavier load than you would have been able to otherwise, or you can move a load farther faster. So you have two different kinds of levers. You've got one called a power level, which gives you mechanical advantage. So you've used this if you've ever, say, used a crowbar or a pry bar, right? You're trying to get some oomph. You're trying to, I don't know, pry up something from. You're trying to pry a big rock. You've got a big rock in your yard, right? So I hope people can see this okay. Let me actually get out of this so we can see, so I can see what you're seeing on my screen. Okay, we've got a big rock here, big rock. I want to pry it up using my lever, and then pop my lever under here, right? I'm going to put this, can you see this okay? I need mechanical advantage. I want power level. So I want to put my fulcrum really close to the load. So I put my fulcrum right here. And as I push down, I'll get mechanical advantage. I'll be able to push this up better than I would have without my little lever system right here, right? If I put my fulcrum way back out here, far away from the load, it's really hard to push down on this to pull it up, right? If I want to push something really heavy, I want my fulcrum close to my load to get mechanical advantage. The other option is to get mechanical disadvantage. This one doesn't help you with the effort required. So with this, a small effort, so mechanical advantage, small effort moves huge load. Mechanical disadvantage, the loads move really quickly over a large distance. So let's say we've got the system here, right? If I have this fulcrum way out here, sorry, I don't know how the best way to show this is. I'm concerned about the lighting. Okay, my fulcrum's way out here. It's not great for prying this up, but I only have to move a tiny bit on the pen to move the cube a long ways. So a tiny bit of contraction over here, assuming it's strong enough, right? A tiny bit of contraction will move this end dramatically. So that if you need to have something that you want to have a wide range of motion and move quickly, you're going to use a speed kind of lever. Yeah? So yeah, okay, here's an example here. The farther, if the effort's farther than the load from the fulcrum, it's going to operate at mechanical advantage. If the effort's near the load than the fulcrum, it's going to operate at mechanical disadvantage for like speed. So that's levers. This last part, in class we go through them and like do a head, shoulders, knees, toes kind of thing. But what I'd like you to do for this is know the general locations of 59 of them. There are more than 600 muscles in the body. We're not going over them all. There are 59 that you should be like vaguely aware of where they are, and there are 15 of those that you should actually recognize where specifically they are. So I will send a coloring sheet out to you guys if you want it. You don't need to turn it in, but if it helps, at least for me, it helps to like draw them in. You could also, if you want to, like as you're learning them, feel it contract under your skin. That helps me as well, right? So This list of muscles, you should know where they are and what they do. I don't have a really good way for you to memorize them besides please just know where they are. And I'm pretty sure you already have a good guess of some of them. So like gluteus maximus, I bet you already know where that one is, right? We're going to look through them briefly. This you will need to do on your own, right? So the muscles of the head, all the muscles listed, be vaguely aware of where they're at, but the ones on this list actually be able to recognize, right? So you've got muscles of the head, you've got muscles of the face, right? These ones in bold, again, please memorize. Muscles of the neck, right? Muscles of the shoulder, you probably know lots of these ones. The deltoid, I'd like you to actually be able to recognize when you see it. Muscles of the thorax, right? A lot of these you know, especially if you've been like lifting weights, you probably know where your pectoralis major is. Muscles of the arm, this is the arm proper, right? So the upper part of the limb, right? Triceps and biceps. Forearm, there are lots of muscles here, lots and lots and lots. This one's worth knowing, right? Brachioradialis, that one's worth knowing. I mean, they're all worth knowing, but you should be vaguely aware of like, oh, this one's somehow extending the digits, right? And so we see that there are digits involved here, extensor. Yeah. The forearm is interesting because there are some muscles here that they act farther out, right? So they're connected with a whole bunch of tendons and stuff, and so contracting muscles here can move things on your hand. Looking at the abdomen and back, looking at your abdominal muscles, this one's actually interesting to me. This rectus abdominis right here, your abs. A lot of people, for some reason, seem to think, so like if you've got a little, I should just draw this. Just a second. Okay, if this is our little stick person buddy, a lot of people, for some reason, think that abdominal muscles go around like a belt. They actually go up and down, right? They go up and down. Just for what's worth. This is for some reason a common misconception to have them belt-like, but they're running up and down. And then muscles of the back here, muscles of the hip. You've got gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, maximus being the major muscle of the bum. Pelvis and thigh, again, there are tons here. You should probably know these two, right? And then this is the leg proper, right? So we were at thigh. Know the leg proper, right? And that's it. So do go through and get familiar with these. Be like, oh yeah, that's where it is. And that's what we have for today. So lecture, look through your book. There are a couple YouTube videos to watch if you want to. And yes, take care. I hope to see you Thursday. I hope that I'm not like coughing or something. And yeah, that's it.